So I'd like to say good evening to everybody and to share with you. I'm really excited to be here tonight and to see such an amazing crowd. My goodness, this is like a Bible study in a Baptist church on Wednesday. And I'm a Baptist pastor, so I'm grateful. I'm grateful for your presence tonight. I'm excited about the subject matter. And before we begin, I'd like to give you a sort of synopsis of what the hour is going to look like. I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and then I'm going to go into a slide presentation about this subject matter, my journey home. And it really is a reflection of my family, and part of my family has really significant roots in this area. It includes Paw and Bloomingdale and Lawrence and other places. Now, I will admit to you, I was born and raised in Kalamazoo, Michigan. But I went to Western Michigan University. So, I was just around for a long time, but I did not make my way to Paw or Bloomingdale or Lawrence. I just discovered those places in recent years. But I do have family that has lived in this area for generations. So I'm excited to be able to share this story and to tell you how I got to be here. So I am on a sabbatical. And I've been a Baptist pastor for 40 years, not in one place. I started in New Jersey. I was there for a couple of different churches. I went to the Detroit area for many years, and I've been in Evanston, Illinois now for nearly 10 years. So I've never been on a sabbatical. So I was approached by the congregation and also by Lilly Endowment, and they asked whether or not I would be amenable to taking a sabbatical. And I had to stop and think about that, because Baptist and sabbatical, those aren't two words that go together, right? So I'm thinking, okay, now if I go on a sabbatical, are the locks going to be changed before I get back every month, So guess what, after all of that conversation, I said, I'm gonna go for it. You have to write a proposal. And the proposal that I wrote was based on the theme, what will make your heart sing? And so maybe for the past 15 or 20 years, I've been doing really modest investigation about my family. And others who are even in this room have done more, much more. They are archivists in this family, and one of them is a local Paw resident, Sherman Ampey. So we're grateful for his presence in this place, and learned a great deal from him, and I'm looking forward to learning a great deal more. Another one is a cousin, Vincent Taylor. And Vincent lives in Benton Harbor, but grew up in Kalamazoo, and he's done a tremendous amount of work on the family as well. So I have been building on the work that has been done, and I will say this, because it's very important. I majored in English and creative writing. I am not a historian. I could not be a journalist. I have an imagination that is a flight to fancy. So when I share this information with you all, I will say probably 80% of it is going to be historically accurate, and 20% of it is going to be me filling in the spots that I was not able to find. So you've heard of historical fiction. So this is what we are going to be focused on, and we've written a manuscript. And I think I'm going to stop. I think that's it, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay. So again, this is titled The Journey Home, Tracing and Discovering the History of One Black Family in the United States. And this is my family in terms of I have 6 children. Somewhere in the scripture said, be fruitful and multiply. So I did. So I have 3 girls and 3 boys. So we grew up in Kalamazoo, and a part of my family on my mom's side, we were taught that family is the most important thing besides God. And so for us growing up, the best time of the year for me as a child, the youngest of 9, was the family reunion that was held on the 4th of July in Kalamazoo. Now, my mother's family has been having family reunions for a long time. So at the top of this, sorry for the blur, there's a family reunion, that was held in 1927. And then 50 years later, there's a family reunion held in 1977. I'm not so sure that they missed a year. So it's year after year. That picture on the top is a picture of the Whaling family, and in the front row are children. And the third child from the right is my mother, Kathleen, who was born in 1919. The child on the left is my Aunt Madge, Vincent's mother, who was born 2 years later in 1921. There are other folks in that picture as well. On the bottom picture, I'm in there somewhere in that melee. I think I was a high school senior at that time. This is a picture of my brothers and sisters. We had this picture taken at one of my parents' wedding anniversaries. Now I'm going to talk for just a few minutes over the next few slides about one side of the family that married into the Ampey family. This is a picture of Albert Whaling. And I was just in North Buxton, Ontario, Canada last week. And that's going to make sense in a few minutes. Albert married Emma. They were married, an interracial couple who I say fled the South. They may have just left, but again, that's my imagination. They left the South to marry and raise a family. Albert was born in Ohio and joined the Army during the Civil War. He served the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry and probably fought in the battle at Saltville. After the war, Albert worked on a farm. I say North Carolina, may not have been North Carolina, may have been another state. He and the farmer's daughter, Emma, fell in love. In 1866, they left. They married around that time, and ultimately they lived in North Buxton, Ontario, Canada. All 7 of their children were born in North Buxton. The youngest of those 7 children would have been my maternal grandfather, Alfred Whaling. They eventually moved to Kalamazoo. So I had a great time in North Buxton, found a lot of information. My cousin Vincent Taylor is in possession of a Bible that was given to Emma, the wife of Albert, and presented to her, and the date is 1863. That's an original piece. I mentioned to you a little bit about the Battle of Saltville. It was a terrible battle. I'm not going to go into that now, but if you ever want to find out about the battle that took place in Saltville, Virginia, it was horrible, and I just wanted to share that with you. This is a picture of the North Buxton school children in Ontario, Canada. My family would not have been in this picture because the picture was taken around 1900, and my family would have left there prior to that, probably about 10 years prior. But the North Buxton school was an amazing school because it was for Black and white children, and they taught an awful lot of different things. You know, it wasn't just a primer school from K through 8th grade, but they taught Latin and French and German and all sorts of different things. So these kids were awfully smart. How many of you learned Latin when you were in elementary school? Anybody? How many of you know Latin now, right? You know? Okay, all right. So just an incredible story. So again, this is a picture of North Buxton where I entered into last week. It is very much like Paw Paw. It's a lot of farmland. North Buxton does not have one stop sign. It does not have one traffic light. You know, you blink your eyes and you're on the other side. But it was a very, very important place that was founded in 1849 by Reverend William King, who was a Presbyterian minister and who inherited slaves when he married the daughter of a slave, of a plantation owner. And when the plantation owner died, he received those slaves. He tried to free them, but the state was not allowed, did not allow folks to free their slaves. Many states were like that. And so after the death of his father-in-law, his wife died. And so he decided that he would take those slaves and move to Canada. And he received permission to purchase 9,000 acres along Lake Erie to start North Buxton. and it was a great joy. Those 9,000 acres are all farmland. I want you to know that. And again, I couldn't find a stop sign at all. So this is a picture of the fellow in the black who is the oldest, the third from the right, is Albert Whaley. And these other pictures are include his sons and also 2 cousins. And the one on the right, who's standing in a very cool way, probably because he's the shortest, that would be my grandfather, Alfred Whaley. This is a picture, and it's important for you to understand that not many African American families have these kinds of pictures that are so old. So this is an incredible collage of pictures that, for the most part, was put together by Vincent Taylor and others in the family. But Vincent played a major role in colorizing them as well. So this is a picture of Albert and Emma's daughters who are in there, as well as a husband and other family members. This is one side of the family. These are the parents of Emma Clow. My mother used to keep a picture like this in her bedroom, and I was always puzzled when I grew up, and I would say, "Well, Mom, who are they? You know, and she would say to me, they're your family members." But she would never tell the story about how they were family members. So this is the mother and father of the woman who married Albert Bell. Okay. Now this is a beautiful picture of my mother. We're going to make a quick shift now, and this is my mother at about the age of 18. Another picture of her and her birth and death, and this is a picture of her mother. This is my maternal grandmother, Hilda Jones Welling, who grew up on a farm very close to where we are right now. She was born in 1888 and died in 1977. This is a picture of her mother. And this is Alice Ampey Jones Scruggs. She has a lot of names, but that Ampey is the important one. Alice was the oldest daughter of 7 children born to Isom Ampey and Mary Campbell. She was born in 1867. Now, I gotta stop here and tell you a funny story, weird story, strange story. So, I'm pastoring in Detroit, and I get information about a church in Evanston. It's 2003. And the church is like, we're very interested in you. Are you interested in coming and looking at us and preaching for us? We think that you might fit for Second Baptist Church Evanston. And I'd been in the church in Detroit all of 6 years. So I wasn't really ready, but I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll go over and I'll preach. So I go over to Evanston and I preach, and it's really great. It looked like a match. I started to pastor in Princeton, New Jersey when I was 25 years old. By this time I'm 54. I'm like, well, I started in a university town, I'll end in a university town, right? So I thought it was very exciting. It was wonderful. I didn't get the job. It was 2003. I was like, my goodness, God, you have such a sense of humor. I just don't understand. I'm walking around, the church is within walking distance to Northwestern University. I'm also a professor, right? So I'm like, I'm imagining myself in a tweed jacket with patches on the elbow, smoking a pipe I've never smoked in my life, but I'm like, I see this, I'm supposed to be here. And it didn't happen. So my mother, who was alive at the time, she died a year later, she said to me, Michael, why do you want to go to Evanston? So, you're doing okay in Detroit, you haven't been there very long. I said, I just felt something. And that was pretty much the end of the conversation. I did not learn until several years later that Alice Ampey, who was born here, probably in Lawrence or Bloomingdale, left and spent most of her adult life in Evanston, Illinois. And I have found out so much about Alice. When I told the story, 12 years later, the church opened again and invited me back. I'm like, y'all not gonna mess with me again. However, I decided to go over. I felt that, sense, and they called me this time. So when I shared with them my family connection with Alice, 2 things happened that were just really incredible. And it just has to be divine intervention, right? So I had a deacon who was probably about 80 years old. This is about 10 years ago. He said, Reverend, I'd like to make an appointment with you. And he did. And he came into the office, and I'm like, okay, he's going to tell me, something about himself. I'm going to learn about him a little more. He said, Reverend, I was the next door neighbor of your great-grandmother. I was 16 years old when she asked me if I would become her driver because they told her she couldn't drive anymore, and she just bought a new car. He told me everything that you could imagine about Alice Ampey and her husband, Charles Scruggs, who was the city's first black, I think they called them chiropodists back then, but we would use the term podiatrist today. So I think that's just an amazing story, and it was meant for me. Don't you think it was meant for me to be in Evanston? Well, you don't have to say that, but I think I was meant to be. So that's the story about Alice, and we'll probably come back to that a little bit later. So next, we have Alice's father. And again, Sherman or Vincent could get up and talk about this all day, but this would be my great-great-grandfather. This is Alice's father. This is Isom Puckett Ampey. He was born in 1841 in Richmond, Indiana, and he died in 1905, just down the road. He was very active in this area before his death. He was a Civil War veteran, and you can find a ton of information about Isom Ampey and this area right here in the library. So now we're going to make this shift, and we're going to talk about the Ampey side of the family. And I'm going to skip through some slides here, but we have a family member, and I found this information out through Vincent, that actually fought in the American Revolution. So I want you to know that. That goes back a long ways. And I'm going to keep going now, because this is all wonderful fiction. This is my imagination running away with me here, but we'll get to that a little later. So there's more information about the American Revolution, information about Alexander Hamilton. You might be interested in this. Initially, when the war started, it would take years before the colonies decided that it was important to have Negroes to fight in the American Revolution. And they did not do that until the British began to promise slaves their freedom if they fought on the British side. So that went on for the first few years of the American Revolution until Alexander Hamilton, right? Yeah, how many people have seen the musical Alexander Hamilton? right. So Alexander Hamilton wrote a letter, and the letter that he wrote was to George Washington and also John Jay. And part of the letter reads, "The contempt we have been taught to entertain for the blacks makes us fancy many things that are founded neither in reason or experience, and an unwillingness to part with property of so valuable a kind will furnish 1,000 arguments to show the impracticality or pernicious tendency of a scheme which requires such a sacrifice. But it should be considered that if we do not make use of them in this way, the enemy will, and that the best way to counteract the temptations they will hold out will be to offer them ourselves. An essential part of the plan is to give them their freedom with their muskets. This will secure their fidelity, animate their courage, and I believe will have a good influence upon those who remain by opening the door to their emancipation." So those are the words of Alexander Hamilton, and if you saw the musical Hamilton, they just put a little rhyme to it and music, and made it absolutely amazing. There's more information here about that. I'm going to keep going. My family on part of this side comes from Dinwiddie County in Virginia. That encompasses both Petersburg and Richmond as well. This is a figment of my imagination here as well, I'm sorry, and that is the War of 1812. I couldn't find anybody in our family, Sherman or Vincent, who fought in the War of 1812, so I just made it up. because I majored, in English and creative writing. So I actually placed James Ampey in the War of 1812. The math would have worked, but I'm certain that he did not fight. So I placed him at the Battle of New Orleans. That was fought after the British had already given up. For those of you who are wonderful historians, you know the war was over, but the information did not get to the British leaders until that battle had been engaged. So it was an unnecessary battle, but there were two Negro infantries that fought in that battle under the leadership of Andrew Jackson before he became president. So I'm going to keep going because that's all imagination, but when my book is published, you're going to love it. You're going to love it. Yeah, you will. Okay, so keep going. Good stuff. It's good stuff. Okay, now we're going to get to this interesting part about the Ampey family and how we eventually wound up in southwestern Michigan. In 1806, the Virginia Assembly passed a law stating that all formerly enslaved people freed after May 1st, 1806 were required to leave the Commonwealth. In 1803, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed as well. So Virginia was a state that had thousands of free Negroes early on, right? In the early 1800s. But something happened. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but something happened after the Fugitive Slave Act that made it dangerous for free Negroes to live in Virginia, to live in North Carolina, to live in South Carolina. And as a result of that, there was a mass exodus out of those southern states to go west where the expansion was occurring. They had some assistance and some help. And the assistance and help that they had were from Quakers. And so I want you to know how important that is. The Quaker and the black community goes back a long, long ways. And I'll tell you where I was over the weekend. I was in the early part of last week, I was in North Buxton, Canada on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I was in McNabb, Illinois. Anybody ever heard of McNabb, Illinois? It's right next to Standard, Illinois. Anybody ever heard of Standard, Illinois? It's right next to Cedar Point, Illinois. Anybody ever? No, it's in the middle of nowhere. But it also is the place where Illinois has their annual Friends Quaker meeting. And they were having their annual Quaker meeting over the weekend and invited me to come down and offer a specific presentation. And I did that. And it was a great joy. So I'm going to talk to you now about how the Quakers and the blacks moved from those southern states heading to the west. Okay? And I hope that you can visualize this. They were forced to do that for many reasons, not only Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, but other places as well. Because the laws that were passed prevented Quakers and other whites who wanted to manumit their slaves from freeing their slaves. The law said you can't do it. If you want to free your slaves, we will take your slaves and we will enslave them. You are not allowed to free your slaves in these states. Can you imagine that? That was law. So, as a result of that, Quakers and blacks sort of had something that was amazing. Quakers did not believe in slavery. You all got that? They also didn't believe in violence. And so as a result of that, amazing things happened. And one of them, and I know that, again, Sherman and I were talking just a little bit about this before we came in. So George Mendenhall was a Quaker, and he had a plantation in Guilford County, North Carolina. So Sherman, I want you to know I'm mixing fiction with fact here, okay? So keep that in mind. So, but the fact is, he had this plantation, and he was a Quaker. He inherited the plantation through marriage. He tried to free those slaves that I just mentioned, and the state would not allow him to do so. So blacks stayed on the plantation. I'm not so sure that he treated them as slaves. I don't believe that he did so because of his Quaker beliefs, but he also was not allowed to free them. And so this happened for a number of years. His first wife died, and he married another Quaker woman. And the second Quaker woman was like, well, yeah, we're treating them well, but they still don't have their own freedom. So we're gonna do something about that. And in the mid-1820s, they took about 30 of the blacks who lived on their plantation personally, and in a wagon train, they went to Mount Pleasant, Ohio. Has anybody heard of Mount Pleasant, Ohio? Come on, y'all. Oh yeah, we have one. All right. So Mount Pleasant was an exciting area around this time because it was an area where Benjamin Lundy lived, and it was the center of the beginning of the abolition movement in Mount Pleasant, Ohio. And Benjamin Lundy was one of the first major abolitionists who also happened to be a Quaker. So what I did is I took James Ampey, who had married Dicey, and I put them in that group that left with George to go to Mount Pleasant. And even though I'm not so sure they went to Mount Pleasant. I think they may have gone straight to Richmond, Indiana. But we'll talk about that in a minute. So I believe that Sherman also has original documents that are the papers that helped the Ampeys to move from North Carolina to Indiana. Because if you were a black at that time, you had to prove that you were free by having documentation. So in between that, though, we have this Ohio stop, and so we talked about the Fugitive Slave Act already. This is Benjamin Lundy, and was a very, very important figure in the history of the United States, but especially the abolition movement. In my imagination, I see James and Dicey probably meeting Benjamin Lundy in Mount Pleasant, sharing their own story, but something happens in Ohio. So the blacks who fled the slave states and went to Ohio because it was not a slave state were sorely disappointed, because shortly after arriving, probably around 1820, 1821, the Ohio legislature passed a series of laws that created so much difficulty for free blacks to live in Ohio that they kept on moving. They had to pay $500 to the county clerk. They had to get a white person to serve as a sort of supervisor for what they were doing. If they were moving from one area to another in Ohio, they had to pay a fee. So all of that made it really, really difficult for blacks who remained in Ohio, so they kept going. And the next stop that they went to, those who were Quakers, who were also upset by this, they kept going and went to Richmond, Indiana. And it is in this area where James and Dicey had most of their children. And then the records are a little skeptical. Some of the records that I show are one child being born in Guilford County, North Carolina, another one being born as they made the trip to Indiana, but dying as a small infant in Ohio, and they had 13 children. The rest of the children, 11, would have been born in Indiana, in a place called New Garden Township, Indiana. It's also called Randolph County, the same area. I'll be going there in 2 weeks. So the advancement into Indiana, a strong influx of free blacks migrated to Indiana. The largest number of blacks wound up in Randolph County. Quakers also migrated to Indiana and Randolph County, so they're sort of living side by side. In 1845, remember I told you about the school that was founded in North Buxton around 1850? Well, this is 5 years earlier. There's a school that was founded called Union Literacy Institute in Randolph County, Indiana. And you gotta get this now, it was an integrated co-ed school. 1845. Talk about progress. Talk about progression, right? With the assistance of the Quakers and also the free blacks who were living in that area. So the history of African American settlements in Randolph County is notable for 3 large prosperous communities: Cabin Creek, Snow Hill, and Greenville. So my family members, James and Dicey, would have landed in that area sometime in the late 1820s, right? And I'm sure some people can give more specific data about that. So, here's my imagination again, although I don't think it's all imagination. Levi and Catherine Coffin were considered major conductors on the Underground Railroad. Often enough, they're called the grandparents of the Underground movement. They also were Quakers. This is the thing that blows me away, and it'll blow everybody away except those folks who know it. You know where they were born, and particularly Levi? Guilford County, North Carolina. The same place that James and Dicey left. Important. It can't be coincidence. It can't be coincidence. It's amazing stuff that is going on here. So he was born in Guilford County, the same county that James and Dicey departed from, and they moved to Fountain City, which is very close to New Garden and all of those other places in Indiana. They arrived around 1826, which means they would have arrived around the same time as James and Dicey Ampey. We know the Levi and Catherine Coffin story because that's in our history books related to the Underground Railroad. But we don't know the story about James and Dicey, and I think all of that is about to change. Yeah, this is going to become amazing. I'm prepared to make this amazing. Are y'all gonna help me? Okay, all right. So then you have all of these children being born, 13, 18, they had 13 children born between 1829 and 1849. The school opens in 1845. There's no way that anybody here can tell me that the Ampey children did not attend Union Literacy Institute, which was just down the road. If all of them didn't attend, some of them had to attend. Remember, they were farmers. So when you're farmers, your kids, really have to work on the farm, right? Why do you think they had so many children? They had children so that they could have farm hands. That's exactly what that was all about. So this is the Indiana General Assembly. They took note of the influx of blacks into the state in the 1820s, and so there was an issue. In 1824, the state of Indiana passed their own Fugitive Slave Act, and that became a major problem for runaway slaves who had run to Indiana, which was a free state. That opened up the door for slave traders and slave catchers to come into Indiana and to return them into slavery, or to kidnap some and take them into slavery. In 1831, the Indiana Assembly required all blacks to pay a $500 bond, just like Ohio had done a few years prior to that, and more laws. That was a major issue. James and Dicey Ampey, I believe, were not only farmers, but there's some indication that they may have been carriage makers as well. Okay, I'm going to go back to that. Sorry, this is very sensitive. So the records of James and Dicey's family show the birth and death of their children, which is amazing. There's also information about where they were born, where they died. Many of the children migrated to Michigan probably after the Civil War. Four of James and Dicey's sons fought in the Civil War. One family, 4 sons fought in the Civil War. 4 sons: Thomas, Isom, John, and George. The journey continues with the Civil War. Thomas Ampey and Isom Ampey joined the Massachusetts 54th Infantry Regiment in early 1863. I told you I'm a writer, so although I love to talk my head off, I love to read as well. So what I did is I wrote about how I thought, this is fiction, Thomas and Isom came to join the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry in 1863. So I'm going to go ahead and read this for a few minutes, and remember, we're going to stop at about 1:45 so we can do Q&A as well. So this is from the manuscript for my book, and so I have Thomas and Ampey leaving Indiana and making their way to Massachusetts. The commander selected to lead the 54th decided to expand their efforts. Flyers began circulating around the country, and one of them found its way to Richmond, Indiana. In addition, the commanders enlisted the aid of well-known abolitionists, and in early 1863, Frederick Douglass spoke in multiple locations, offering a call to arms. Quote, "Men of color to arms," he said. Liberty won only by white men possesses no shred of value for us. One flyer read, now in camp at Reedville, Massachusetts, 54th Regiment, volunteers composed of African descent, Colonel Robert G. Shaw. Colored men rally round the flag of freedom, bounty $100, at the expiration of the term of service $13 a month, good food and clothing, state aid to families, recruiting office at Cambridge and North Russell Streets, Boston. I'll be there in early August. With great excitement, Thomas and Isom approached their mother. Dicey had been a free black woman who lived in Northern Virginia before she and her husband James moved first to Ohio, then on to Indiana, living among Quakers until they could fully support themselves. Dicey offered blessings to her son and helped plan their trip from Indiana to Massachusetts. One early, very cold, rainy morning in February, Dicey gathered the family together in the farmhouse, offered a prayer for traveling mercies and the protection of her family and her sons. Neither Isom or Thomas had ever been out of Richmond County, Indiana. The plan for travel was extraordinary. With the help of Quaker friends in Richmond, they mapped out their journey to Boston. The distance was nearly 900 miles. Aided by friends living in Richmond County, they left their family farm with a group of Quakers who were headed to a new settlement in southwestern Michigan. This would take them out of their way, going straight north rather than moving northeast. But traveling with Quakers gave them the benefit of transportation and food. The first part of the trip was passing through cornfields in northern Indiana until they reached the southern border in Michigan. Isom and Ampey walked through the fields and forest in southwestern Michigan surrounding the Quaker settlement. There was a quiet beauty in the land, and it almost seemed like the wind was whispering their names. Thomas said, Isom, I do believe this is a place where we might raise our families after the war. The kindness shown to us and the considerable affection we have been given is surely a sign from God that the land here is good as the people who brought us to it. And I was thinking the same thing, responded Isom. One thing we know, our lives will not be the same once every battle has been fought and the war concluded. While I loved Richmond County and the fact that we were born there, to spread wings into this territory may afford even more opportunities for us. And then it goes on. I'm going to read a little bit about someone that also spoke to them in this area. This is fiction. Thomas and Isom, I pray thee that your journey to Boston will be well, and that God's presence will keep you safe from hurt, harm, and danger. And would to God that when the war is ended and you are safe, might you consider a proposal from our family and our settlement? Thomas and Isom looked at each other, then at Samuel, both nodding yes. We pray that you may return to our settlement here in Goblesville after the war. We ask that you may join us where we are prepared to share our land and have you live among us. We know your family is in Richmond. We know that you have been raised well and that you both fear God. We have seen your hard work as farmers as well as your love for our country. We believe God will deliver you from the pestilence of this present war, and in so doing, God will bring you both back to this place where you may begin new lives with new families, new hopes and new dreams for your children and their children after. And it goes on, having a conversation about folks in this area, and then they make their way to Massachusetts, where they're very, very briefly trained. And then they go into battle. So they arrive in Massachusetts probably in the early spring of that year, and they find themselves in the 54th down in Charleston, South Carolina, at the Battle of Fort Wagner, right? So the battle takes place, and I make this up again, but I just love this. I'm telling you, I think something moved me to write this, even though it's not, factual, it's fiction. But here we go. This is a letter from Isom about the battle at Fort Wagner, which took place in July 1863. My dear mother, I do pray these words find you and my dear brothers and sisters well. It has not been 6 months since Thomas and I departed with your blessings to join the 54th. And yet it seems like it might have been 6 years, or 16, or 60. Our fearless leader, Colonel Shaw, who although white has fought for the rights of his colored soldiers with the same veracity as he fights the rebel soldiers, the dreaded Confederates. Once we were without provisions of boots, while there was still snow on the ground. The colonel forced open the dispensary where provisions are stored, took note of the abundance of boots, and made sure each of us received the same boots as other white soldiers. He said to us then, "We're all fighting the same enemy. We must do so with the same provisions." On another occasion, it became apparent that colored soldiers were not receiving enough food, nor the same food stock as other soldiers. Outraged at such injustice, Colonel Shaw decided to raid the rations building. For at least 3 days, we colored soldiers ate better than everyone else in camp. Thomas and I were very duly impressed with our leader and his commitment to the rights of his colored soldiers, even as we all fought for the right of freedom for the coloreds living in the South. And Mother, the colonel is barely older than Thomas. However, one wonders about those in charge of Union troops. The colonel has also said he's filled with fury. When he first found out the pay of colored soldiers is very different and lower than the pay of white soldiers, he was beyond consolation. He said to us then, "Your flesh is ripped open by the same bayonets and bullets as white soldiers. Your blood pours a crimson red to the ground with the same red gush as those soldiers. The aim of your guns into enemy lines is just as sure as white soldiers. And if you're captured by those rebel devils, you will surely suffer far more than white soldiers. Therefore, your pay must be either the same or even more." You can rest assured, Mother, that the rally of support and cries of yes and amen were all louder that day than ever before. Still, while we receive more money than most of us ever made before joining the 54th, it is far less than white soldiers, though we do exactly the same thing and perhaps with more fervor. I am writing this letter just a day after our failed attempt to take Fort Wagner, located in the Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. It was easily our greatest challenge, made all the more difficult because we lacked rest. We had only recently returned from James Island and had been without food or rest for 2 days. Upon our return to the main force of the Union troops, we were directed to engage a frontal assault at 7:45 p.m. at the fort. It was nearly impossible as the fort was shielded by marshland, making movement slow and opening us to the aim of enemy soldiers. Even so, we reached the outer wall of the fort and held ourselves against it for a short time. We attempted to storm the wall by night, but underestimated the rebels. Soon enough, we were forced to retreat as enemy troops grew stronger in the fort. Nearly half of our regiment was killed, wounded, or missing. Colonel Shaw took a hail of bullets to his chest and died instantly. Along with so many in the 54th, he was buried in an unmarked grave by the enemy. Mother, I don't know exactly what words to use, but Thomas was in that number of fallen soldiers. My brave brother and your fearless son died a hero's death, gun in hand, aimed at the enemy as he and I were fighting side by side. My heart is grieved dearly for him, and I find myself living out a nightmare from which I cannot emerge. We have been in this war day after day, side by side, since we left home. We trained together, we ate together, we slept side by side, we fought before and always emerged to talk about it. Yet, as I saw his body falling lifeless before landing on the ground, a rage that I have never known flooded my soul. I grabbed his gun, and along with mine in the other hand, I aimed to high hell at every enemy soldier in sight, pulling the triggers and reloading until my own soldiers pulled me back to safety. I thought, surely if Thomas has died, then I too shall make this my last battle, the last step of this short journey of life I have traveled. But the bullets went by me, to my left and right, above me. Not one penetrated my clothing. I do not understand it. I'm left to wonder. Our colonel has died, and there's none left to plead our cause with the eloquence and force he used on our account. Countless of my friends and fellow soldiers now lie in a shallow, sandy grave outside the walls of this infuriating fort. My brother, who was to me my dearest friend, my fellow pilgrim, the one with whom I shared my dreams, is now gone, and I am but 22. My dear mother, what is this war for? It was so clear to me only a few months ago. Thomas and I arrived in Massachusetts with the purpose of defeating the Confederates, freeing our brothers and sisters from a life of slavery, and beginning a new nation where everyone was equal and worthy. And yet, we've not even been treated with equality by the very side of this war that seeks to end slavery. I fear that when this fighting is complete, and the Union has won, and there's no doubt that we shall be victorious, that our people will continue to suffer and struggle to reach our potential and achieve success. Mother, I'm at a loss. I will continue to fight on behalf of Thomas, who no longer fights with me, but I know this too. I shall never be the same. Your loving son, Isaac. So my thinking is, if Isaac, if he didn't say it, he should have said it. Amen. If he didn't write it, it's something he probably felt for sure. So, okay. So it's coming. The book is coming. I want you to know that. It's coming. So more information here, and give me just about 2 more minutes. Thomas and Isaac fought in the Battle of Fort Wagner. We mentioned that already. George Ampey, the other brother, fought in the 28th Infantry of Indiana. Joined it in December of 1863. John Ampey joined the 23rd Regiment, United States Colored Troop, in December of 1863. And these are not pictures of them, I'm sorry. So I don't have pictures of the two, but these are members of those regiments, but not pictures of the Ampey. So I just want to make that clear. This is clearly a picture of George and Isaac Ampey. So the journey continues. George was tragically committed to the St. Elizabeth Hospital in Washington, D.C., which was an asylum. He did get released from there a year later and came to Lawrence, Michigan, where he married Eliza Warricks, and they had 5 children. Eliza died in 1895 and George died in 1918. James, the 5th child of James and Dicey Ampey, died in 1885. This is a picture of Isom and several of his children. The woman to the far left would be Alice, and then there are other names here as well. I'm rushing through so we can Q&A. So these are plots of land in this area that you all are probably aware of. I think Marty was telling me she's looking through stuff like this, trying to find patents. That's the most gorgeous, the most wonderful kind of job in the world, don't you think? I'm just kidding. So it's a challenge to go through this kind of stuff for sure. So, okay, so this is a picture of Main Street in Goblesville in the late 1800s. I have this in the postcards that I was given as well. So now ending it out, this is the sad part of the story, but Alice, who married young here in the area, married a John Jones, and they had a child, my grandmother, Hilda. For some reason, Alice leaves, and she leaves when Hilda is just a very small girl, and she winds up in Evanston, and she remarries. And she remarries a fellow named Charles Scruggs, who at the time was attending, you gotta love this, he was attending Shoals School of Podiatry. yeah, Shoals, right? It is real school over in Chicago. And he did, as I said, he became a chiropodist. But there's a difference between their age that's just amazing. By the time they get married, which is probably around 1912 or 1913 in Evanston, she was born in 1867. He may have been 25 years younger. Isn't that interesting? She made corsets as a professional. And the information that I received from the folks in Evanston is that she was such a professional making corsets that some of her designs were in Vogue magazine in the 1920s. Gotta love it. So I'm gonna end there. There's a lot more, but I'm gonna end there. I'm gonna stop and open up for some Q&A. The story goes on, obviously, with Alice having my grandmother Hilda having 4 children, and those 4 children, Vincent, if we had remained in Kalamazoo, all of our family members, we would be the mayor, we would be the police chief, there are so many of us. We probably would have produced a governor of Michigan if we'd all stayed in the same place. But at any rate, this is good stuff. I'm excited, so thank you for that opportunity to look and listen, and I'm going to open up for questions. questions or responses at this time? You guys seem so quiet. Oh, yes, I got to see a hand.
When
Yes.
is your book coming and what will the title be?
Well, see, that's a good question. I thought my book was done. I thought it was done. It is 400 pages. But as I started to do this traveling during my sabbatical, I'm learning so much more. And after this presentation today, I'm sure that when I get a chance to spend time with Sherman and Vincent and maybe even others who are here, I'm going to have to make changes. And they may even try to convince me to not make it historical fiction, but to just make it history. So we'll see. But the fiction I just love. And I just love the fiction. I love that letter that Isom wrote to his mama. I love it. Yeah. Books within. Other thoughts? Because keep in mind, y'all, so much of this is around here. I got into the area on Monday, and I'm looking at all of this information that family has put together, and I'm visiting all of these cemeteries. Robinson Cemetery, up the road somewhere, Prospect Lake Cemetery, all these. I went to Prospect Lake Cemetery last night. I went at, dusk. You probably shouldn't go to Prospect Lake. I'm out there, I'm like, okay, it's getting dark. I got lost 3 times trying to get here, You'll probably know where it is, And I found some of the grave sites as well. So the family was here, probably Sherman starting right after the Civil War, maybe before, but we definitely can trace Isom and George here after they were mustered out of the Civil War. And so it's just amazing. It really is. And I have other family members who are here. So I'm going to ask if my other family members, I have sisters who are here. I have Jan, one of my oldest sisters, and Kathy, and her husband, Damon. Would y'all please stand? Yeah. Those are my 2 beautiful sisters, my brother-in-law. I have my son, Jarrell, who is here with his wife, Ashley, and with their daughter, Nigel. Would you all please stand? And Gordon. Oh, and David. Whole family. And I have my cousins, the Taylors. Would y'all please stand as well? Love y'all dearly. Love y'all dearly. And this is all connected to the Ampey family as well. So again, my excitement is that I'll be going to 13 different places on this sabbatical. And I gave the presentation to the Quakers in Illinois over the weekend. I gave a presentation to the folks in North Buxton last week. And I'm excited about all of the other places that I'll be going. Richmond County, Indiana. I'll be speaking at Earlham College and Bethany Theological Seminary. I'll be at Virginia Union Seminary. It's a benefit to be a preacher, because seminaries don't have anything to do, in the summertime. and so they asked me if I would speak. So I'll be there in Richmond. And so I'm just really excited about being able to share this story and for you all to know how magnificent this place is. And I want to say this because it's important. I know there may be other questions. But the thing that's driving me and that's motivating me about this story right now, because I've been writing this for years and years, is, I think our country is at a crossroads. And I think that's really true when it comes to race relations. I think we're struggling with that right now. And to be able to say, but there's a story, and it's probably not so unique. This story of this family can probably be duplicated by many other families where blacks and whites were working together. We're fighting for the rights of everybody in this country, starting all the way back to the American Revolution. And it wasn't all whites, right? It wasn't all whites and blacks. We know what else existed. But there are stories within the reality of the messiness that we are in that I think needs to be heard and needs to be told and read about and shared. And that's my motivation. My motivation is to try to shift this thing that has happened where we're becoming isolated and to say we've got so much more in common than we do those things that make us different. And that's what the story is hopefully going to do.